Joining us now is Jessica Genauer, a senior lecturer in international relations at Flinders University. Jessica, thank you very much for your time. Firstly, you've recently written a piece on the likelihood of other countries being dragged into the conflict. Could you briefly elaborate on some of the key regional players that could be pivotal?
Yeah, for sure. And thanks for having me on the program. So this is quite a volatile situation that we're seeing right now with the conflict between Israel and Hamas. And there is concern that other regional actors could get drawn into the conflict. And in that regard, there are a few states that we need to keep a close eye on. First and foremost, Lebanon, where there's also been a fair amount of focus from analysts and commentators on the Hezbollah group in Lebanon and whether or not they might actually ramp up actions on the Lebanon-Israel border to the south of Lebanon, north of Israel, and whether that could actually drag Lebanon itself into the conflict, because Hezbollah are essentially a part of the Lebanese government. So any deeper involvement from Hezbollah in the conflict would essentially have the implication that Lebanon itself would be dragged into a state-to-state conflict with Israel. Some other countries we need to watch in the region are also Syria. There have been some attacks, rocket attacks from Syria going into Israel, and then some retaliatory strikes as well back into Syria. So that's another kind of fracture conflict line that we need to pay attention to. And then there are, of course, other regional players that are going to be important. For example, Egypt, that really sits on that Rafah border from the Gaza Strip into Egypt. So, of course, has a critical role there in determining, what type of aid can pass into the Gaza Strip, but then also who can come out of the Gaza Strip. So Egypt is kind of a key player in that regard as well. And then we have other regional players further afield that we need to watch. For example, the Houthi group in Yemen, who've also been getting somewhat involved in the conflict and are also backed by Iran itself being a key regional player here. And then also, of course, Qatar, who've been involved behind the scenes in some of the negotiations to release hostages and have a very close relationship with the Hamas group themselves, housing Hamas's political offices in Doha.
Well, let's speak a bit about Iran then. They are the biggest backer of Hamas. What are the main ways it is supporting them in this conflict, and why?
So for Iran, it's quite interesting because, in fact, whilst Iran sits on one side of the kind of Shia-Sunni divide within the Middle East region, and Iran is, of course, a Shia state predominantly, and so therefore has a natural affiliation with groups like Hezbollah that are also a Shia group, it's quite interesting because Hamas, on the other hand, is actually a Sunni Muslim group, so sits on the other side of that kind of regional fracture. But there is an alignment of interests there between Iran and Hamas in the way in which they are fighting against Israel and have been engaging in a conflict with Israel. Of course, for Hamas, that's a much more immediate on-the-ground conflict. For Iran, that takes place more in terms of rhetoric and geopolitical tensions. But that's really where their interests align, and that's why Iran has been providing financial backing and also support in terms of military training and equipment to Hamas.
Jessica, after Mr. Biden and Mr. Blinken's diplomatic push, Prime Minister Netanyahu says that Israel is open to little pauses in Gaza. Are their appeal likely to pay off?
I do believe that we will see some type of humanitarian pause in the coming days and potentially in the coming weeks if Israel's ground operation into Gaza continues over that time. And that's because of this really quite dire humanitarian situation in the Gaza Strip and the fact that countries that are, in fact, allies of Israel, so prominently the United States, but also countries like the United Kingdom, France, are going to increasingly pressure Israel to at least provide for these humanitarian pauses so that, you know, citizens who need to get out can get out. There can be populations that can leave Gaza, or foreign citizens in Gaza can leave the Gaza Strip, but also importantly, that humanitarian aid can come in. So whilst we're unlikely to see a broader ceasefire at this stage, I do believe that we will see those humanitarian pauses take place.
And coming back to events on the ground, Israel's defense minister says their troops are in the heart of Gaza City. Why is that important for Israel, and what might fighting in Gaza City look like?
So this is part of Israel's stated military operation that they declared would take place after the events of October 7th, that attack from Hamas into Israel, which was to essentially ensure that Hamas could no longer operate as a military or as a political entity within the Gaza Strip. Now, this is something that's actually going to be incredibly challenging to achieve, and the fighting in Gaza City is a part of that objective. So Israel has now gone in, the Israeli Defense Forces have now gone in with ground troops, with tanks into the Gaza Strip, and they're essentially trying in this very difficult urban environment to find and eliminate Hamas militants and Hamas leaders. This is an incredibly difficult operation because of a few factors. I mean, first of all, there's the existence of the tunnels underneath Gaza City, of which we're all aware. So, of course, that provides a refuge for example, Hamas militants or Hamas leaders potentially. But also there's just the fact that because Hamas is a non-state actor, so they're not a conventional military actor, those Hamas militants will be incredibly difficult to distinguish from the general Palestinian population in Gaza, in the Gaza Strip, or in Gaza City. So this makes this a very complicated operation where Israel would need to have very good intelligence in order to be able to ensure that it is actually sort of carrying out the objectives that it's stated in terms of that those military objectives. But it's likely to be very challenging with very high costs on both sides.
All right, Jessica, we'll have to leave it there for now. Well, thank you very much for your insight this morning. Jessica Genauer, a senior lecturer in international relations at Flinders University.